Joe, please.
Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Tonight we'll be covering the Analects, chapters 9, verses. We'll start with verse 6.
Seven, please.
Or verse 7. Forgive me. It's great to be back. Would anybody like to read their version of the Analects? Penny, would you mind?
This is a short one. Lao said, "The master said, having no official employment, I acquired many arts."
Thank you, Penny. Would anybody else like to read their version?
I've been reading a second if nobody else has one.
This one was
I have one, but you, why don't you go ahead? You can go ahead.
The DC Lao. Verse 7. Lao said, "The master said, I have never been proved in office. That is why I am a jack of all trades."
Okay, I think this one is simple, and then okay. Lao said, the master used to say, "I was not tested, hence I gained skills." Okay, so basically this one, Lao, some scholars said Lao is Yuan Xian, okay, the Confucius disciple. In the book 14, start with Xian-esque, so that means Yuan Xian-esque something to Confucius. That's book 14. And here say Lao, okay, could be Yuan Xian, we don't know. But here is Lao said, the master used to say, okay, I was not tested. Among suggests I use test instead of employees or being hired in the government service, because the original Chinese is shi, that means test. Okay, so I think it's preserved the original meaning. And this one you can see it's a continuous, talk about the same subject as chapter 6, the previous one, because in chapter 6, Confucius said that when he was young, Confucius said, "My condition was poor when I was young, and therefore I acquired skills in many low jobs." Okay, so chapter 6, Confucius said he was poor, in a poor condition when he was young. That's why he get many skills. And this section is another commentary on previous chapter about Confucius skillful, because he has not been hired in the government. Because when you work for government, you either working on the military, then you only have the military skill. If you only work for the finance, you only have the financial skill, because he has not been hired. So he get many skills. So I think that's my interpretation. Thank you. Come on.
Yeah, would you like to?
I guess we're back to last week, and I want to delve just a little bit into this idea of class consciousness, which is not something we're very comfortable with in a Western culture that thrives on the notion of all men created equal, quote unquote. There is no such concept at Confucius' time in ancient China, and there are certain expectations of people of a given class. There's an equivalency that exists within our modern society, but as I mentioned before, I had heard that most people are only aware of a class above and a class below themselves, and have no conception that there could be a class above that and a class below that, and so on. In Western society, in our modern contemporary Western society, we have a 0.1% class of inherited wealth. Many of you might be familiar with the concept of old money. Among that class, the notion of work is seen as gauche. It's something that is, maybe you do a job because you needed to, you know, stretch your legs a bit in your youth and get, but the idea that you would actually be working for a paycheck as some sort of necessary means of survival is just anathema to most of that class. I believe it was Disney's great granddaughter who was kind of poo-pooed because she was working at nonprofit. She was, you know, not delving in the family wealth. I could be wrong about who the identity was, but there have been a few people like this who sort of go against the grain of their class's expectations. In Confucius' case, that same sort of non-working expectation would have existed even though he wouldn't be that 0.1% of his contemporaries in his society. But it was almost shamefaced for him to have to continue to say, I had to take a lot of employment when I was young. It's not something he was proud of. And he saw it as a consequence of the failure of the system around him in his time. Not merely that his father had died, but that the waning Zhou dynasty was not robust enough to lift up a gentry class that might have just needed the tiny little boost to put them in their proper place. So this kind of continued harping at acquiring multiple skills is a little bit of self-effacement on his part, but it's also a bit of an indictment of how fallen the Zhou have become.
Thank you, Aman. Would anybody else like to comment on verse 9.7? Well, if nobody else would like to comment at this moment in time, I'll go ahead and just make a quick comment, is that from this is consistent with what we've read in the Analects up to this point with Confucius, as far as again, having multiple skills and not necessarily being able to hold or being given a government position. So I don't have too much to add to that. So if there's no one else to comment, I will go to 9.8, but Brian.
The one thing that struck me in comparing the chapter 6 and 7, in rereading now chapter 6, the master does not make any claims about having many arts. Other people said that about him, about his ability, various abilities. He himself is not reported to have said that. He's reported to have said, in effect, that a variety of skills is not needed to be a sage. And that's the only assertion he made. And here if this is true, Lao is putting words in the master's mouth. He's having the master say that he did acquire many skills. Or many arts. That's the first time, I guess, he's saying that. If it's true, he's saying that about himself, and it kind of cuts against the. That's in my recollection. That's the first time, and it cuts against, the humility that I think I've absorbed about him in our previous sessions.
Thank you, Brian. Is there anybody else that would like to comment on 9.7?
Maybe I would like to say something.
Sure, please.
I I don't know how to say it, and I might be wrong, but we often hear the concept of Confucius being humble. I'm not sure that it was a goal in his life. Uh, at the time, he was born at a certain social station, and he wanted to embody, to incarnate the obligation, the duties of that social station. So when he was interacting with the higher nobility, I'm not sure that the word humility in its moral sense would convey what was truly in his mind when he was behaving in certain manner with the higher nobility or with the Duke of Lu or with other dukes, okay? Because it was more etiquette, okay? He was a gentleman, and there was some specific behavior that people expected of gentlemen, meaning he was not part of the 0.1% of the Chinese society at the time, but he was part of the 1% of the Chinese society of the time, okay? Meaning that he did not have the wealth and the power of his cousins of the high nobility, but he was a noble man, which separated him drastically and dramatically from the 99% of the Chinese population of the time. So I would say that he was not a humble man. He was a man with the behavior of the gentleman of his time, and he had the ambition to restore the power and the glory of the Zhou dynasty. He considered as the perfect incarnation of culture for him. And that culture is still the culture of the Chinese nowadays in terms of identification and representation of the world, okay, the core identity of the Chinese nation nowadays, meaning the cultural legacy of the Zhou dynasty, having ruled truly between 1045 BCE to 770 BCE, and having been cultural arbiters between 770 BCE to 256 BCE, when they were destroyed by the great-great-grandfather of the first emperor of China.
Thank you.
I just want to say I agree with Huang, always associate the humbleness or humility with Confucius, which may not be correct, because if you read through this one, you will see he's really, really a strong, big guy, and follow the ritual and strong personality. So, yeah, especially in the book 10, you probably will feel that. Yeah.
Allison.
I thought it was really interesting what you're saying, Aman, about the 1%, this idea that you're not supposed to work, because I've known 3 people who were probably in that 1%, and I could never figure out why they never had a job. I mean, I knew they didn't need one, but I remember them always sort of wrestling with this idea of how do I make myself useful, and I was like, get a job, and they just didn't want to do it. And in one family, the mother came from very old money and the father had grown up poor, but then created some business and became extremely wealthy. And then they had very different ideas about their son and what he should do. And the mother was like, it's fine, he never needs to actually do much of anything. And the father was just livid that the son needs to, do something on his own and make something of himself. And, and I remember he was like working at like the grocery store just because his father cut him off. And it was like, and it was so strange watching all of this as an outsider, because I was like, just get a job. Like, I don't understand. But that kind of crystallizes it, that if you don't need the money, that it would be almost like a bad thing to work when you don't need to, like you're taking a job from somebody who might need it, but yet you're trying to figure out a way to find something of value to contribute. It's just very interesting that you said it, just kind of like made a lot of sense. Yeah.
Thank you, Allison. Sebastian.
Yes, I was struck with the word skill. And most of us think of it probably as a manual skill. But I think what he had intellectual properties that he wanted to bring forward. And if he's added, I don't know the class structure per se, but in order to assimilate or discuss things with a hierarchy, he probably was well versed in this, and that was his skill, his many skills, and his skills to vacillate from perhaps art into music or politics. Although he never attained the mastership of it, he still was able to discuss multiple things with the gentry. And he also, I think, was, in my opinion, humble enough to realize that he could bring his skill, whatever that be, this non-manual skill, to those who are doing manual work, so that in a way he could kind of magnetize or assimilate two types of cultures or classes. And that's what, in my opinion, made him an exceptional person.
So his skills mostly were in the sense, leading people to live a better life, more on an ethical level than obviously the skills that those obviously cultivated, and through rigorous study. And I guess if he were working all the time, maybe that would not have been so much of an option, or if he'd been involved with government, that I can't say.
Yeah, I thought that perhaps it's more, it was like he had certain types of knowledge, but his ability to make people understand was very important to him. At least that's the way I'm reading it. Yeah.
Aman, followed by Quan.
I wanted to say two things, and I think, Sebastian, you were very close to something, though I think maybe, and not to cast aspersions, a little too Hegelian, the idea that he was looking to synthesize multiple classes. I think he was very much a binary visionist who wanted to elevate those of merit from a class into another class. That really was, that's why there's so much emphasis on a junsa is ... A junsa does ... because he saw it as not inevitable that the class you were born to what determined your character. You could elevate yourself, and education was a key for that. As to this idea of humility, I do think that it has become a fundamental tenet of Confucianism, that humility is a great value. But I think it comes from the fact that from Confucius, you get what I would describe as an honest measure. You must be able to make a truly honest measure of yourself, which is why at times he sounds humble, probably when he's speaking about himself in a younger period. And at other times he sounds very sort of full of the gravitas of his station and authority, because he's able to make an honest measure of himself in relation to the world around him. So I do think there's a distinction there. And I get why it comes off as humility and why humility is extolled, because until you have acquired the wisdom to make that honest measure, the better default is to be humble, because you don't yet know if you know enough to yet call yourself qualified to be someone who knows something. It's more elevated version of imposter syndrome, which I think most people have experienced at one point or another. Those were the two things I wanted to point out. But I think there's some great ideas bouncing in here. And as to what Alice has said, yes, that idea that working is gauche, not just because it takes away, but because you can use the family wealth to do so much more. So you should start a nonprofit, you should throw charity balls, you should do functions that contribute more greatly than your menial manual labor.
Okay. With that.
Come on.
Thank you.
Okay. The thing that I would like to add is that let's not forget that this Analects has been produced and added, corrected between 479 BCE, the year Confucius died, and the destruction of the Principality of Lu in 249 BCE. Okay, so about 230 years. And during that time, that book has been used as a kind of manual for the students of his school of the Rujia in the Principality of Lu and in other principalities. What you can see historically between with 9.6, 9.7, and you will see 9.8 is that during that time, the opponents of Confucius and of the Confucian schools used the fact that he has been forced to work to get a living to mock him, okay, to laugh upward and gauche, as Ammon say, for a gentleman having to work to get a salary. It was a way to laugh at him. And if you read, there's between the lines, there's an apologetic intention, okay, like in the hagiographies of saints in the Catholic Church. It's a justification, because let's not forget that even if chapter 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 probably have been written in the 3 or 4 years after his death, most of what has been written outside those 5 chapters, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, have been edited, okay, during the 230 years between 479 BCE and 249 BCE. So there is an apologetic intention showing that the enemies of the master should not have laughed at him, okay? So there's that thing, and that's why Confucius sometimes answer sarcastically. And I suspect that later disciples would invent answer that he would have given according to the more historically authentic answer he gave.
Thank you, Quan. Would anybody else like to comment on 9.7 before we move to 9.8? Some great points made by everyone. Thank you. So Penny, would you mind reading 9.8?
Okay. The master said, "Am I indeed possessed of knowledge? I am not knowing. But if a mean person who appears quite empty-like ask anything of me, I set it forth from one end to the other and exhaust it."
Thank you, Penny. Mom, would you mind reading the DC Lao version?
Certainly. 9.8. The master said, "Do I possess knowledge? No, I do not." A rustic put a question to me, and my mind was a complete blank. I kept hammering at the two sides of the question until I got everything out of it.
Well, I must say my translation is very different. So
I'd like to hear it.
yeah, go ahead and read it. It's 9.8.
Can you read your translation first?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. The master said, "Do I have knowledge? No, I did not. Even when a humble man put a question to me, however, I scorned both ends and exhausted the question as though I felt empty.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting because that's all because Chinese language is not very clear on the tense, on many on the and also on the punctuation. So let me read my translation. The master said, "Do I possess knowledge? I possess no knowledge." That's he said, 无知也, I possess no knowledge. When a simple man asked me a question. Okay, so here's the problem. That's when monks will suggest use the present tense, and I think it's a past tense, because Confucius said, "I have no knowledge." Then when he said, "A simple man asked me a question," we don't know. He just say it's a common, a case like this, or he's talking about used to happen. There's one simple man asked me question, right? But I prefer to use past tense. The reason is the word 有, okay? That's a Chinese word 有. You can say it's if, but most likely it has been happened before, okay? So, but not 100%, but most likely is this. So that's a small part. When a simple man asks question, I empty my mind. Okay, that's another problem. Why have you hear different translation? Chinese 空空如也, that means empty mind. But since there's no subject, so we don't know. Emptied mind is Confucius said, I empty my mind. I don't know anything. All these words is describing the simple man. As Confucius' question, he doesn't know anything. Okay, so we don't know who doesn't know anything. But personally, I prefer to explain as Confucius doesn't know anything from the simple man. Okay, the reason is Confucius beginning with say, I possess no knowledge. So my interpretation would be used to have a simple man ask Confucius a question. Confucius has to empty his mind, and then he kept tapping at the two ends of the question until I got everything out of it. So I will explain this one, interpret this one is, and look at the big picture on the book 9. In the book 9, most of part is dealing with Confucian epistemology. So I tend to interpret this one as Confucius talking about his way of knowing things. So he's talking about empty my mind and then consider on the two sides, kind of like, try and error. Okay, is this one too much? This one too little? And to the point, okay, he got the answer. That's my interpretation. But of course, not everyone have the same way of thinking. So another way to think about this one is talking about Confucius, how serious of Confucius about teaching. So you can interpret as even a simple man asked me a question and he doesn't know anything. And Confucius still work very seriously, try to tap in on the two ends of question to find the answer for him. That means how serious of Confucius on teaching, even for a simple man. So that's another way to read this one. So it's up to you. And I also like to hear how do you think about all the different ideas. Thank you.
Aman, would you like to go ahead and comment?
I'm actually just very tickled. I hadn't actually gone back and looked at this verse since we had discussed it in our back and forths. And so I didn't see where Jason actually settled on an edit for it. And I very much appreciate that you kind of retained both potential versions, because it allows one to read it. First of all, somebody who knows the classic Chinese or knows Chinese would know there is no tense. And so it's not possible to say if this was past tense or present tense, but reading it in both ways give two very different sort of instances of whether or not he's making the hypothetical or whether or not he's reflecting on a previous approach. I really do appreciate that. And if I accuse Sebastian of being too Hegelian before, here's where you can really let it fly, because this does feel very much like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, where he's talking about tapping two sides of the question and emptying his mind. So removing any bias, looking only at the two possibilities and waiting for a synthesis to arise from it, with one possibly greater than another, but both potential approaches accounted for. And that combined with the synthesis of past and present tense in this, I think it's a wonderful translation. I very much appreciate it.
Okay, I'll just make a brief comment. You know, what I took from this, from 9.8 specifically, when I read my version, was this idea that Confucius learns by teaching others, essentially. That's that he is questioning or putting everything he knows out there, and it is kind of testing it. But essentially, the feedback getting is how he essentially learns, and that's his way of attaining knowledge is through teaching, which is actually interesting, because I mean, that's still, I still think that that is the most effective way to acquire knowledge, in my opinion. So that's just my interpretation when I initially read it. It may not be accurate, but it's a opinion. So I will go with Mark, followed by Jason, then Quan.
Thanks, Joe. And it's so great to hear everybody. I have a couple of, I'm so glad, Ammon, that you said that about the dialectic and about Hegel, because I was almost going to call you out on it, because you had mentioned it in the previous discussion that you thought someone was being too Hegelian, and you recognized it yourself that this was a counterexample. Really fascinating. And I was wondering, I kind of lost my place here because I'm in Slingerland and I just changed the place. I'm trying to get back to it. I think I was wondering about not only how, Joe, you said that it's in teaching others that he learns, but in Slingerland, he has this word discussed. I discussed the problem with him. And that, I think, goes even further. It suggests the kind of debate or discussion, I don't want to say that you sort of find in the Platonic dialogues, like knowledge will only be discovered through discussion. But that implication there, and I thought, Joe, that your translation sounded so different because it sounded as if it ended with the idea of coming up empty. Like that was the sort of denouement, whereas I think the other three, including Jason's, was more in line with the idea that first they were empty and then later they found something. So I was wondering about that word discussion, if that's going to be important. And the word that I know you said, Jason, that you can't tell what the subject is of coming up completely empty, but what is the verb there? And because Slingerland's I came up completely empty is kind of abstract. Is there something more that you can also say about the verb there? Thanks, everyone.
Oh, okay, yeah, it's my turn, and that's first. Let me answer Mark's question. Okay, Chinese has no tense. Okay, we know that, and then another challenge is the sentence can have no subject. Okay, unlike Latin, you have no subject, but the verb will change with the subject, so you have idea know who is referred to. But unfortunately, Chinese doesn't have a subject, and the word doesn't change form. And the third challenge is every single word with the same writing, same pronunciation. It can be adjective, it could be noun, could be verb. Okay, so you have no idea. So that's the big challenge. So to answer Mark's question is, they say kong, kong, ru. Okay, so two same words, empty, empty, like. So, so I don't know which one we should consider as verb, or none of them are verb. So we don't know, because Chinese also use to repeat the same word to make it more strong. So for example, kong means empty. Kong kong means very empty. So that's that's the challenge. So open question. You do whatever you want. That would be the best answer. The reason I raise my hand is I try to tie back to my interpretation. This book is about Confucius epistemology, because at the beginning of the book is talking about the Confucius really spoke about the advantage in related to fate and the ren. So, how he argued on this one. And I strongly, another thing is, please look at chapter 4, right? Confucius, the forbade the 4 things, right? And no conjecture, no insistence, no stubbornness, no self-centeredness. So I think they all talking about epistemology. And the previous 2 chapters talking about his skill, how he acquires skill. So that's why I believe, I tend to interpret the whole book is about epistemology. So that's my personal opinion. Yeah.
Thank you for Jason. Quan.
Yes. Before I give my my comment, I would like to read the Eno translation. Okay.
Please.
The master said, "Do I have knowledge? No, I do not. If even a bumpkin asks a question of me, I am all empty. I simply tap at both ends of the question until I exhaust it." Okay. So I go back to Jason's comments. Kong Kong. Okay. When you repeat twice the same word, it means vary that same word. Okay. So Eno translated in the second interpretation by Jason, I am all empty. I'm exhaustively empty. I'm completely empty. So my comment on that, and I think that Eno got something here, because let's not forget that one of the role that Confucius pretended to incarnate, to embody, is to be the transmitter of the cultural legacy of the Zhou dynasty. In that sense, he's not empty. He's full of something he wants to transmit. But on the other side, and here I would like to come back on the notion of humility, because each time we think that Confucius is humble, I would have preferred to say that he is open-minded. Okay, in the sense that one of his role is to be full and to transmit the cultural legacy of the Zhou dynasty, that one. But on the other side, he's capable to put that cultural legacy aside and to be capable to receive the questions with an open-minded. If you replace empty by open, I think that it can be interesting. Okay, I simply tap at both ends of the question until I exhaust it. And I come back here to the notion of dialectics, okay? Because dialectics, after all, what is it? It's the playful exploration of a problem, okay? And that playful exploration of a problem, of something, is done precisely through the open-minded conversation with oneself and with others. So on one side, he's not empty, he's very full of the cultural legacy of the Zhou dynasty. And on the other hand, he can be very empty in the sense of being open-mindedness, being capable to examine sincerely the questions asked to him by others.
You know, I'll just make a quick comment to that. I mean, I went back and forth that interpretation as well, almost that, and I appreciate you saying open-minded, because I almost thought that this is kind of a beginner's mind, that that Confucius was approaching this, that I don't know anything. So like this is a kind of a search for knowledge. And that's, I wrote that down, but I didn't share it because it was hard for me to make that leap in the translation that I had. So I appreciate that, Quan. Next up, Allison.
Yeah, I think that if you're going to teach something, you have like there's 2 points in here that I really see. I mean, if you're teaching something, you have to understand it at a much greater level than if you're not teaching it, because you have to explain it to somebody. But also, I really love this whole idea, like in my version, it says, you know, the whole idea that the mind at first is a complete blank and I have to knock it both sides of the question until everything has been considered. Because the thing is, you're throwing an idea out there, and then as you get these different questions from people, it helps you refine your ideas and makes you reconsider them in a different way than you would have otherwise. Sort of like the whole reason we come here, like we could read this book on our own, but we understand it so much better when we're considering all the different viewpoints about it. It helps us to see it much better. I remember in college, a professor asked, what do you need to be an educated person? And I said, a library card. And then everybody argued with me and they said, no, because the whole thing is that you need to be in the room with the other people discussing everything that you got at the library. And that when you're just studying something on your own, there's just a limit to how much you're ever going to really understand it, because you're not getting multiple perspectives that challenge you. So even if you're Confucius and you're the most knowledgeable person in the world, you still need to be challenged by others to help you to really understand it at a much higher level.
I agree with you, Allison. Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. I think wisdom is attained by engaging with as many different people with as many different perspectives as possible. So kind of taking that information and kind of integrating it, and somewhere in between is, you know, it'll change your perspective. But that is wisdom. That's how you attain wisdom. Penny or Brian?
Okay. I had just gone back to a verse from chapter 7 that seemed kind of related to me. I'll read here the NO one. The master said, there may be some who invent without prior knowledge. I am not such a one. To listen to much, select what is good and follow it, observe much and to mark it in memory, these are second to knowledge. And it seems, which people have said kind of, that's similar to what he's doing here. He's not talking, observing a lot of people here, but when somebody comes with a question, he doesn't say, oh, I know what's going on. You know, he's open-minded, he listens to what they say, even if it's a simple person asking it. And then he considers himself kind of like being different voices. You know, okay, it could be this, or it could be this, it could be this, or it could be this. And then he selects. So it seems kind of like a similar process, but in this time, he's doing it himself, being the people who are, you know, listening too much and selecting what is good and following, observing it. You know, he himself is providing different viewpoints as he thinks about it.
And what chapter was that? I mean, I know it was book 7, but
20.
which verse? 28. Thank you for that. Would anybody else like to comment on 9.8? Sorry, Mark.
Thanks, Joseph. I just wanted to mention Slingerland has a really interesting comment on this one, where he understands that someone is praising Confucius for being omniscient, and Confucius is saying, no, it's not as if he's divinely inspired, but whatever he understands is gotten through sheer hard work. So he says that he's trying to instill in his disciples a sincere desire to learn, since the master's apparent wisdom is not the result of innate intelligence, but merely of sheer persistence.
Thank you for that, Mark. Yeah, I think that's somewhat consistent with a lot of what was said. So appreciate that. Okay, so why don't we move to 9.9.
Okay, and this again is the James Legge version. The master said, the thing bird does not come. The river sends forth no map. It is all over with me.
Thank you, Penny. Mom, would you mind reading your verse?
Book 9, verse 9. The master said, the phoenix does not appear, nor does the river offer up its chart. I am done for.
Because mine is so, once again, different, I'm going to go ahead and read it. So the master said, the deity Fang does not arrive, and the He river no longer sends forth a chart. It is all over with me.
So I'm surprised you say that's different. To me, that's all the same. So, okay, let's see why we have this kind of difference. So the master said, the phoenix does not come. The yellow river does not produce a map. Alas, I'm finished. So this one is a few times. In general, I think I should not say he's optimistic, but a little bit sometimes he is very pessimistic, right? So there's some historical background. The phoenix, that's the bird, the legendary birds. And then when Sun, the ancient king, and King Wen, okay, was reigning, and during that time, the phoenix, the birds appear. And then during the Fuxi, which is long time before Yellow Emperor, okay, who is before Yao and the Sun, that's an ancient sage. They have a horse coming from the Yellow River, carry a map. So these two things being considered of the sign of sage king. So Confucius said, the phoenix doesn't come. The Yellow River does not produce a map, or one call it a chart. That means he cannot wait for the sage king. So he's waiting for the sage king. That's why he say, alas, I'm finished. Or I say, it's all over again. If you remember on the, which book? Book 7, chapter 5, he said that he's not dreaming about the Duke Zhou for a while, okay? So he feel like, it's over because he's old, and then Duke Zhou is not, this kind of person is not coming. And later on in the book 15, he also talked about I never see a person like virtue, just like sex. Okay, that's a very famous saying. He see people like sex, like virtue. So, and he said it's all over. Okay, again. So it's a pessimistic. So that's I remember that's 3 times he seems very pessimistic. So that this is one of them. I will read this one similar with the one he talked about dreaming of Duke Zhou. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Aman.
I would agree. It has much the same tone as when he's speaking about no longer dreaming of Duke Zhou, and that is a sign of his waning value. But there is something, I'm not even going to call it a humble brag here. We were speaking about his humility. This is a full-throated bragging of one's ability when he's basically saying that but for the rise of another great sage king, no one's going to appreciate me. It's going to take somebody like the Yellow Emperor or like, Fu Xi to be able to appreciate what I am really trying to bring back into this world. And since those are not to be had, I am done for. Alas, I am finished. There's the opposite of humility in this statement. There is a whole lot of valuing oneself in a very high esteem. But again, I think it's also done out of an honest measure of his ability and his character, because he would be right. It took someone's greater than Fu Xi or greater than the Yellow Emperor. It took the entire propensity of Asian culture and thousands of years for his true full appreciation to be realized. So it couldn't happen in his time. One figure couldn't do it. That's all I really wanted to say about that. Otherwise, I think I like with Jason, most of these read the same, but it's because if the He River is a way of saying the Yellow River, and the Fang bird could be translated as the Phoenix. Suddenly all of these things start sounding very similar.
Thank you for that, Aman. Yes, and thank you for the pronunciation, the Hung River. I forgot. I read that incorrectly. So, Quan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aman, for having brought those points, because, well, ironically, it did not take a Shun or a Fu Xi, but rather the collective effort of the princely family of the Qin dynasty between 361 BCE to 221 BCE to solve the problem. That is the low down-to-earth answer. But I would like to go back to something less down-to-earth. Here we have, once again, I want to go back to the notion of humility, okay? Confucius, I would say, had the proper behavior of the gentleman of his time in the Chinese cultural context. So it's very rare to see a circumstance in which he would fail to have the proper behavior expecting of him. In that sense, he was appropriate, okay? However, he would have messianic moments. And I would say that 9.9 is one of those messianic moments. That he felt that he was truly invested with the duty and the mission to restore the glory of the Zhou dynasty. And in that sense, he was not arrogant in the ordinary sense of the word, as you truly explained, Aman, because he was truly convinced of his mission. So there's a sense, I think that it was you too, Aman, who used that word, that I would repeat that word because I think it's very appropriate. He has a very deep conviction of the gravitas of his role for this mission to restore the glory and the power of the Zhou dynasty and to transmit their cultural legacy. He failed for the first part, but he succeeded for the second part, the cultural dimension. And that is the end of my comment.
Thank you, Juan. Mark, would you like to comment?
Thanks, Joseph. I can't quite remember all of the translations that were just read out. I noticed that Slingerland has a question at the end of it. Is it not? It's all over for me, is it not? And I just can't remember if the other translations that were read had that interrogative, and whether it slightly counteracts some of the pessimism, the deep pessimism here. Is it possible that it's not completely over for him? And then my other question was about, well, it's all over for me. So I guess there's an implied subject there or indirect subject. It's not saying, is it that it's all over, period. And then my other question was about the references to these mythological events, like Fuxi and the phoenix that was supposed to be like a horse with wings of some sort. Is that something that Confucius is buying into, or is he just using it as a symbol, really? Did he have an attitude towards those mythological creatures, a rationalist attitude, or not?
That's a very deep question, Mark.
So
Let me
do Jason.
Yeah, let me answer the first question. Okay, I think it's Aman already highlight for me to mark the question, right? Let me read the Chinese word "wu," that means I. Second word "yi," finish. Then there are the two words "yi," "hu," okay, that's no meaning. In Chinese has no punctuation. So that's why your translation will put a question mark, because who a lot of time being considered as question mark, but not always. Okay, sometimes it's just ending. Okay, so we don't know. E, it means another punctuation. So that's why we are dealing the challenge we are dealing. That's why I keep complaining. The big challenge of translate this text is I try to figure out what's the tone, okay? Because a lot of time Confucius asked himself a negative question, okay, and the negation. So I just have to figure out what does he meant. So you put a question mark to the end, that's perfect. Technical is not wrong, okay? So I just have to find a way to explain it. And then second thing is just Kwang said that's a deep question, like how does Confucius believe some mystical sign? I would say no, okay. He many times he talk about heaven. In general, he is not superstitious, right? When remember, I think book 7, he was sick, and the Zilu tried to pray for him, And he said, "Well, it's useless. I did that many times." So he doesn't believe this. So but he do believe this kind of symbol, or not symbol, I would say message. Okay, he do believe this kind. So for example, I think the Kwang would know better, is when he comment on Chunqiu, which is the official history analect, official the official history of the state of Lu. He finished to the point when is that the king, the duke, right, capture a qilin, okay, which is an animal, have a good sign. To stop there. I think that he used this one as a starting ending point. So he do use this kind of symbol, or you want to say message from the heaven, the phoenix, the chart from the river. He do use them, but I have to argue, he is not superstitious person. He is not a mysticism. So that's I have to say. Thank you.
Yeah. I would like maybe to add a small thing. Within Chinese civilization, there's a tension between what I would call the mystical proclivity and the rational proclivity. And Confucius, I agree with Jason that Confucius is rather on the side of the rational proclivity.
Thank you. And looks like Amon and Jason both want to comment on that.
I just have to play devil's advocate here a little bit. I have to say, compared to his contemporaries, yes, one would probably have met Confucius in his time and said, boy, that man's missing a lot of spirituality. He's way too much of a rationalist. By our standard, I think we would consider him highly not superstitious. He exhibits the same sort of cognitive dissonance of a Newton, someone who is very rational, but does believe in higher powers and higher works in order in the universe, and that they are beyond his capacity to capture. I do think that Confucius would have actually had that sort of same cognitive dissonance of a figure like Newton. If you ask him, so how do you explain Noah's Ark? If you were to ask Confucius, so how do you explain the Feng and the Cixin charging out with the map? He would say, in the golden times, magical things could happen. They don't happen anymore. But when great, sage kings were in rule, many things were very possible. I do think that he was less the sort of stark rationalist that we would envision, because even as you move through the centuries, the most educated of Chinese people were still also deeply wedded to what Quan referred to as sort of that mysticism that exists in the culture. The real divide between what would become superstition and hyper-rationalism came with the communist revolution, where anything that was not purely rationalistic and objective scientific fact was treated as superstition and antiquation to be expunged. That still lags within the modern Chinese psyche as something almost irreconcilable. It's very hard to sort of square your head around the idea that great thinking figures also believed that, Pangu made humans by flicking fleas off of his body. But there were certainly many a great Confucian sage who absolutely believed that, even though it wasn't the most popular of creation stories. So I did want to push back just a little on this picture of him as a pure rationalist. The other thing I wanted to say, my respect for Professor Slingerland is extraordinary, but in this instance, I do agree with Jason and not him in terms of the translation. I read those two finishing particles, yi hu, as done. It's kind of what we were saying before about kong, an emphasis of empty. Here it's saying done, really done. That's how I read that.
Great comments. Thank you, Ahmad. Quan.
Yeah, I would like to come back to the tension between the rational proclivity and the mystical proclivity.
Mhm.
One historical filiation that could illustrate that is that a Chinese mythology is relatively poor compared to Greek or Roman mythology. Okay, but there is a reason for that. After the time of Confucius, let's say during what we call the Warring State period, okay, 450 BCE to 221 BCE, many Chinese scholars of the time just remove many stuff they consider as superstitious. And the mystical proclivity or tendency in Chinese civilization, at least among the scholars, is more metaphysical. Okay, they would envision things they are capable to see that there are things that are happening in space-time that can be explained by causality, and there are things that they would put in the concept of heaven, okay, of the timeless dimension. Okay, there you have moral concepts like truth, goodness, beauty, things like that, and their religiosity, their religion is an intellectual religion. Okay, it's more the balance between heaven and earth and that kind of thing, and the mystical forces, but they would shun away the beliefs in ghosts or in by calling directly to the intervention of spirits and so on. That kind of thing is more labeled or categorized as a popular superstition. Okay, so you have what I would call a kind of metaphysical religion, and you have a religion that would go through more popular concepts like ghosts or spirit, but it can be a mix. And the fact that Chinese mythology is relatively poor is precisely because that the people from that rational proclivity clean up a lot of stuff from the past.
Thank you for that, Quan. That's very interesting comments. Does anybody else wish to comment on verse 9? Oh, go ahead. Please, this is actually interesting.
I won't go back and forth on this too much. I agree. To sort of categorize all of one people as all of one way is absolutely unfair, and there is a whole spectrum that exists. But some of the greatest of what we would think of rationalists were marginalized in their time, and I was just trying to remember his name, but there was a scholar a couple of centuries later who was a very hyper rationalist, made some very interesting arguments. I'm thinking particularly about his arguments against ghosts, saying, wouldn't there be billions of ghosts everywhere? And when they die, why do they always appear clothed? Do clothes have ghosts? He made these very specific rational sort of arguments against ghosts. He wasn't popular. His arguments were not very popular. Spectral testimony was still accepted in front of a judge. Wang Chong, thank you. Spectral testimony was still acceptable evidence in front of a magistrate or a judge all the way up into the Ming Dynasty. So it really was a spectrum of belief and thought that existed. But it was a murky spectrum up until that communist revolution. Then the divide between rationalist and superstition became so absolute as to be, it was actually part of what the Cultural Revolution was fighting against. And a reason why many classic scholars fled China. The other reason for such the dearth of what we would think of as the mythology was that the stories for China were not as interesting about sort of these removed figures as more recognizable figures. But those recognizable figures were mythologized so that figures like the Jade Emperor and the Lady of the Azure Winds were definitely recognized and treated with the same sort of reverence as Olympian gods, virtually. All right, I don't want to go down the hole too far, but yeah, this could be a deep conversation in and of itself. Let's just leave it as ambiguous. Confucius was somewhere on this spectrum, leaning much more towards Wang Chong than he was, necessarily a Judge D.
Thank you. Kwan, do you want to make a quick, or did not? You're good.
No, I will stop here because, as Ammon said, it can be a debate or a dialectics or discussion by itself for 5 hours nonstop.
So then aren't we following the master because we're looking at the question from both ends and trying to bang out an answer, right? Just like from
Absolutely.
Okay.
Very
Absolutely.
good.
It's pure dialectics. We wouldn't write a dialogue on that.
Well said, Mark. Well said. Well, at the risk of this becoming a 5-hour meetup, that we will move on to verse 10, 9.10. So, Penny, would you do the honors?
Sure.
It is a very important question you guys are discussing, though, because just as far as how it impacts modern day China, I find it to be very interesting. But anyway, I'm not going to extend it. Go ahead.
Okay, verse 9.10. Whenever the master saw someone wearing mourning clothes, or a grandee dressed in court robes, or a person who was blind, even if they were young, upon catching sight of them, if seated, he would stand. If walking past, or he would quicken his step. Oh, I read Robert Enno one.
That's okay.
I have both. I just usually I read the leg.
No problem. Aman, do you want to read your version? Mine's
Sure.
Actually, mine's almost identical to Penny's. Okay.
I was hoping, it's always nice to hear the leggy, but the Enno version is
Read it.
excellent.
True, again, I forgot. I just grabbed the wrong one. You want to hear it? Just
Yeah, instead of me
Yeah.
reading DC Lau, let's hear the leggy as well.
okay.
Yeah.
When the master saw a person in a morning dress, or anyone with a cap and upper and lower garments of full dress, or a blind person, on observing them approaching, though they were younger than himself, he would rise up, and if he had to pass by them, he would do so hastily.
Yeah, mine is very, very close to that as well. So, I mean, almost identical. I mean, I can read it if anybody would like to hear it, but it's literally just the third version of it. When the master saw anyone in mourning clothes, or anyone with a ceremonial cap and the upper and lower garments of ritual dress, or a blind person, he would, on receiving them, always rise, even if the person was younger than he was. When passing such a person, he would always quicken his steps.
All right, let me read my translation. I think basics, all the translation are the same, but only thing is, let me read my first. When the master saw people who, oh, I should change, who were, when the master saw people who were in mourning, in ceremonial dress, or blind, even if they were young, he will rise up. If he had to pass by them, he will walk quickly. Okay, so he will, one thing I'd like to explain is this word qu means space, one kind of walking, walk small step but fast. Okay, so not running, walking small step and fast. Famous thing is book 16, when Confucius stand in the courtyard or in the in the courtyard, and his son passed by. The description is 礼屈而过庭. Li is Confucius' son. When the Confucius' son see Confucius standing there, he want to pass by. He used the word 屈, that means walk fast. So remember, when you walk, pass by your father, the senior, you don't just slowly walk through or running, you have to use the word 屈, that means small step and walk quickly. Okay, so that's the ritual. Okay, and in book 10, because I just finished the translation on book 10, I find out they have the many way of walking, okay, in Confucius, and they all show respect, but I am too tired to figure out their subtle difference. But this word is a little bit relatively simple because he has to qu, that means walk quickly in small steps. Okay, so the second question is why these three kind of people, right? Why you put these three kind of people? People in mourning, people in doing ceremony, and the blind. Why you have to respect these three kind of people, even they are younger, right? Confucius will stand up or walk quickly when he passed by the senior. But for these three people, Confucius will do this way. So I think they have the practical utilitarian reason to do this. The person in mourning, in ceremony, they are focused on doing things, right? They have something in their mind. So when I am in mourning or I'm doing the ceremony, when I see Joe, I cannot say, hi, Joe, right? I have to focus on my thing. So in this case, I walk through or something, I probably will not stop or slow down. So that means Joe have to greet me, even I didn't greet Joe. So Joe will stand up, okay? And then if Joe has to pass me, he has to pass quickly because I will not change my pace. So if you look at these two cases, you will see the blind people also had the same situation, right? He cannot see. So same way, when you see blind people, the blind people cannot greet you, salute to you. So you have to rise up. And when you pass by the blind people, you pass by fast because you don't want to block his way. So I think that's the reason Confucius put these three kind of people together. And it will verify on the book 10. Confucius also talk about, Confucius also do the same thing for these three people. When he, book 10, he's talking about when he's writing on the card, okay, he will salute, okay, to these three kind of people. Okay.
Thank you very much for that, Jason. Ahmad.
So this gives me a chance to sort of share my love of Chinese language. I put the etymology for chu in the chat. It's made up of two characters, to walk, and the character for mow, like to mow the lawn. Or actually it'd be more like reaping. But one thing I would just want to mention is some Chinese words, especially the older ones, are onomatopoeic. They are meant to sound like what they are evoking. So to walk quickly, shuffling your feet, Chu. That's where you get the word from. I just love when those sort of Chinese words sort of fall into place perfectly, and Chu is one of them. So other than that, I'm not going to add a lot. Jason is absolutely correct in why he categorizes these three sorts of people: those in ceremony, those in mourning, those who are blind, and that he would defer to a li, or a ritual, that might not be appreciated by any of these individuals is also something significant about this passage. These three types of individuals might have it lost on them that Confucius was observing the correct li in front of them, the correct ritual. But the master would observe the correct li, not for the sake of just pragmatism and not for the sake of, you know, a good showing in front of others, but because he himself had embodied good li as the practice.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I also agree with Jason on this one. I thought he explained it perfectly as far as interpretation goes. Quan.
Yes, just a small linguistic details. There's an English word which translates exactly to chu, is to scurry, S-C-U-R-R-Y. Okay, why I know that word? Because I read the English translation of the Three Kingdoms by Professor Robert Moss, because at the imperial court, the proper way to move is to move quickly and with short, quick steps, okay? Which is the ritual way to demonstrate that you are eager to serve the emperor.
Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, thank you for this word, scurry. Okay, and I knew this word, but I didn't think about it. But actually, Kwang, you could help me in the book 10. They have a few more words similar to scurry, so that's a good challenge to you. So one day, but if you want to see how the proper walk, okay, go to Japan. Okay. And in the Japanese restaurant, you go to traditional Japanese restaurant, the waitress, when they serve, that's the way they are doing. So that's a good way to observe.
Yeah, they want to show that they are eager to serve the customer who is the emperor.
Are there any other comments for number 10? Go ahead, Mark.
I was just noticing that it was a little hard to hear everyone. By the way, there's someone shuffling here in the background, scurrying around the room. Okay, that was a joke. Sorry.
I was wondering if that was a joke.
Okay.
So very.
I'm wondering about. Thanks, Joseph. There's a kind of hierarchy of li here. Is that possible? Because it usually, of course, it will be age before the younger. But here, when someone is in mourning, or if they are dressed in a ritual dress, or if they're blind, that takes precedence to the fact that they are junior, which becomes subordinate. So there's a kind of hierarchy of ritual here. One thing trumps another.
Yes.
Is that accurate?
Let me ask a question. Okay, so I don't see that's a hierarchy issue. That's probably very subtle. Okay, I think in the book 10 also talk about this. Okay, so that's very important in Confucius teaching. Confucius is still in a higher ranking than this person in mourning, blind, or ceremony. But that's a case Confucius has to show his attitude of the, that's my opinion. Okay, so it doesn't mean the blind people have a higher ranking in the social structure higher than Confucius, because in this situation, okay, Confucius will show his respect or his ritual on that. One example in book 10 is Confucius was working as a high-ranking government officer at that time, okay, you can call it chief police officer, okay, something like this. When he drinking, he like to drink. He drinking with villager. He will forget his own ranking. He will go by seniority, not by his government ranking. So I think that's the Confucian way of hierarchy.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to add anything to, or to what Jason just said? Okay, Aman?
Yeah, just really briefly. Hierarchy was of consideration to Confucius. It was important. It wasn't as all important as it became later to Confucianism as a absolute fundamental, tenet of how to behave. He doesn't mention it explicitly a great deal in the Analects, only here and there, mostly surrounding the idea of a son to father, in relation to the value of shou, or shao, the shao, filial piety. But the idea of sort of a situational hierarchy is something that is evident in a lot of the passages of the Analects, and that this is taking that honest measure. Good to know when the situation demands that you not default to hollow sort of ritualistic norms, but follow a ritual that suits the situation and take a position that best fits you in that situation. It's a very subtle sort of distinction of, I'm absolutely being good at following the norms and the li. And I'm also really good at knowing when I need to switch gears and follow a different sort of li to be in better ren with my fellow man.
Thank you for that, Aman. So we will go to, with that, we'll go to number 11.
Chapter 11. Yan Huan, in admiration of the master's doctrines, sighed and said, I looked up to them, and they seemed to become more high. I tried to penetrate them, and they seemed to become more firm. I looked at them before me, and suddenly they seemed to be behind. The master, by orderly method, skillfully leads men on. He enlarged my mind with learning and taught me the restraints of propriety. When I wish to give over the study of his doctrines, I cannot do so. And having exerted all my ability, there seems something to stand right up before me, but though I wish to follow and lay hold of it, I really find no way to do so.
Thank you, Penny. Would you like to read the DC Law version, or
Sure.
I can read my version, whatever.
If you'd like to read yours, I'd be happy to hear it.
Okay. Yan Wan, sighing deeply out of admiration, said, when I look up at it, it rises higher. When I try to penetrate it, it becomes harder. I see it before me, but suddenly it is behind me. Our master is good at guiding people step by step, broadening me with literature and restraining me with ritual propriety. I cannot give up even when I wish to do so. I have exhausted my abilities, but something seems to stand up high above me. Even though I want to follow it, there is no way to take it. I'm sorry, no it at the end there.
Okay, let me read my version. Okay. Yan Yuan sighed in admiration and said, "When I look up, it grows higher. When I penetrate into it, it grows firmer. I see it before me, and suddenly it is behind me. Our teacher guides us patiently and systematically. He burdened me with literature and constrained me with rituals. Sometimes I want to stop, but I cannot until I exhaust all my ability. He is like a tower standing. I want to follow him, but I cannot." First, I'd like to mention this one is probably the only time Yan Yuan, as the role model student, he has speak a long time. Usually he only asks one question or do something, okay? He hardly spoke in Confucius Analects. So this one probably the only time he has a long speech. And unfortunately, he didn't say something meaningful. The only thing he just praised Confucius. And personally, I think literally this sentence is pretty beautiful. It's a praising and has been abused in the Chinese history. Okay, so these words when I look up, it grows higher. When I penetrate into it, it grows firmer. I see it before me and suddenly it is behind me. Okay, this kind of words have been used to flatter the great leader, like Chiang Kai-shek's teaching. Okay, so I know this word when I was young. Same as in book 8, 18 and 19, when Confucius praised the ancient sage. And these words are also being used to praise the Chinese historical dictator or so-called great leader. So so that's the, I think the good words have been abused. I think that's the great example. Let's back to the text. I believe Mark will be interested on this because again, he talked about when I look up, it grows higher. So, and I think the other translation called they grow higher. So we don't, because there's no pronoun in Chinese. So we don't know what he meant, right? So at this moment, I just have to assume when Yan Yuan appreciates something, when he look up, something grows higher. When he penetrated it and it grows firmer, it means Confucius teaching or the super Tao, Confucius behavior or Confucius virtue. We don't know. Okay, so but that's something so great, so great. Yan Yuan was saying.
Among.
Yeah, I just want to remind everyone because of the names that Yan Yuan is also Yan Hui, who is the pupil that died young, that was Confucius's golden boy. And
Wow.
Jason's right, this is the longest sort of overture to the master that you get from him. But I do find, and I think it's funny. It's the longest thing he said, and he doesn't say anything of any interest. But I would disagree with that. I do think there was one thing he said where he says, he broadens me with literature and constrains me with Li, because that is sort of what I was parsing out before, talking about this idea of not ritual for ritual's sake, but ritual as a constraint to be engaged in context of appropriate. Here, broadening with literature, opening the mind enough to be able to think of it more than a role to perform, do X. You know, you want to get this job, you do X, you do Y, Z is the result. Your mind becomes broader as you study deeper and you gain greater wisdom from these ancient sages, as you know sort of not just what is connoted, but also what an idea denotes, text and subtext, but constrain you with ritual, in the sense that before you go totally free thinker, tearing your clothes off, dancing under peach blossoms and drinking wine all day, remember you have a job to do. You have roles that you must fulfill. You must be constrained with Li. I personally find that sentence broad. He broadens me with literature and he constrains me with Li to be infinitely fascinating, and probably the best encapsulation of what Confucius was attempting to do with his students in his academy and in his teachings. To both broaden and constrain all at the same time is a pretty high bar for any teacher to clear, and he seems to have done it again and again.
That's a very interesting point, and yes, that would be a challenge, as as you're raising somebody up, you're actually keeping them grounded, and that would be a challenge for anybody. Does anybody wish to comment on number 11?
I'll just ask a small question about, maybe you already said this and I missed it, of what it was that he was looking at. If there is, I think, Jason, you said something about that the pronoun was, there wasn't a pronoun, or we don't know what the it was. Is it the way of Confucius? And when I first read it, I just thought maybe he was referring to heaven. The higher, the more I look up at it, the higher it seems, the way the heavens recede almost from us, the more we try to approach it, we never seem to be getting any closer to it. Or is it the way of life that he's talking about? I don't know, maybe that was already answered, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's an all open question, just like, because there's no single word in Chinese tell about what he's talking about. He just say, when I look up, grow higher. When I bore it or I penetrate, harder, okay? And when I want to see, it's in front, it's back, but he didn't say anything. But you say heaven, I don't think so, because here he used to praise Confucius, so should not be heaven. Should not be the person, Confucius as a person, because I don't think Confucius will grow higher. So only thing we can say is the way of Confucius, or the morality of Confucius, something intangible. So.
Quan.
Yes.
Thank you for raising your hand.
I have a comment, but I would like to go back immediately to what Mark-Say and Jason said before I forget it. I agree that the it here is probably the way of Confucius. But at the same time, the way in Eastern Asia or in China is a metonymic transfer. Okay, it's the way, but at the same time, it's a special way to say the destination of the way too. So if we consider heaven as a Chinese word for truth, goodness, and beauty, uh, it's uh, uh, it's his teaching, but it's also his. And on that, I agree absolutely. I think it's more Confucius teachings, but that's the teaching allowing you or giving you the capacity to reach those timeless values. That being said, my comment on 9/11 is more. He broadened me with literature and constrains me with Lee, and I would say that that's a pair. Okay, broadening by literature and constraining by Lee. And if we go back to uh, 9.8, you also have that dialectics between Confucius is full of the cultural legacy of the Zhou dynasty, but at the same time, he's capable of being open-minded when he received the questions by others. So you have a interaction between being full and being empty. And here at 9.11, you also have an interaction between being broadened with literature and being constrained by Lee. And I would say that there's a certain a parallel between the two interactions.
Thank you for that, Quan. Would anybody else like to, go ahead, Mark.
Okay, thanks. One more small little question was about, I think, Jason, you used the word admiration in the first line, and Slingerland has lamented, which sounds like it has a very different flavor.
Okay, yeah, I think technically, if you read the Chinese word, okay, if you let me show the word. Oh, just 1 minute, I missed it.
My version actually uses admiration as well.
Yeah. But I think that I can understand why some say the lamentation. Okay, because if you look at the pure Chinese word, let me share. That's the interest part. I never think in this way. Okay. 颜渊喟然叹曰, okay, definitely right. If you only see this word, go to Google translation, it could be the mention, okay? Because it didn't tell you you are admiring or feel you lost someone. You can, if I lost some loved one, I may say Jason 喟然叹曰, okay? I lost my loved one, or I in my investment, I lost $1 million. Okay, so they may write Jason 喟然叹曰, I lost $1 million. Okay, perfect, fine. But basics, the context is said admiration. That's why I translate as admiration. So interesting question, you know.
Mark, is that your hand up from before? Or?
Yeah, sorry. Jason. Sorry.
Okay. Go ahead, Quan.
Just coming back to what Jason just said, when someone in the Eno, it's Yuan heave a heavy sigh. But when you heave a heavy sigh, it's because you have an overwhelming emotion inside you. Okay, and that overwhelming emotion, I agree, is admiration, or he's awestruck. I would say he is awestruck by the towering figure of Confucius and his teaching.
Yeah, I agree. Probably admiration is not the good translation. Probably we should call sigh overwhelmingly. Okay, that's probably the best way to talk about, because it's overwhelming. Okay, it could be something bad or something great. We don't know. So yeah.
Now, Jason, do you want to try for 9.12 or do you?
Yeah, that we can, how much time we have? Yeah, I think we can
We
do
only have,
1, 2.
'cause
Yeah, I think that's why we can do it, Yeah.
we may lose them on.
Lose
So that's so what I'll do is we'll read real fast. and then-
We should, or we can finish here. I think that'll be fine, Yeah.
What yeah,
Yeah,
I
that-
mean it.
I've got about 5 minutes, so.
Yeah, I think
5 minutes.
that's no rush, then,
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because yeah, that actually is one I have a
If
couple
it's
questions.
related to this one, we probably can do it together, but it's change subject again.
It
talk
does
about-
change. Yeah, it is different. So this is probably a good stopping point.
Yeah, so
And then
probably-
yeah, okay, let's stop here. So we'll stop here at 9.12. Well, it's good to be back, everyone. And thank you, Juan, Brian, Penny, Jason, and Aman, obviously, Mark, for your contributions this evening. Sebastian, thank you for joining us. And thank you, everyone. And I'm just going to do a very quick overview of what is some of our upcoming events. And so that